Development and war. I'd like to look at the political effects when countries undergo dramatic economic transformations and build their economies, and that link to war. Here you can see a British coal mine, which was a key source of energy during the early stages of British industrialization. Now, Charles Tilly has a famous quote that the state made war and war made the state. An important question Tilly asks is not where our current states have come from, but rather, where have all the states gone? There were nearly 500 independent political units in late medieval Europe and thousands in the world at large. But by the beginning of the century, the 20th century, there were perhaps 40 independent states on the entire planet. What happened to all those political units? Here you can see a sharp rise in the number of political units and then a dramatic drop in those states to the situation where we are today. We have about 200. Europe in 1483 is shown on the map, and you can see the multivarious states. But in fact, if you look at the Holy Roman Empire in the center of what is today Germany, that map completely understates the number of sovereign entities that exist within its borders. There were, in fact, several hundred. And this is Europe in 1910, largely as a function of political units being consolidated, such as the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, when Prussia incorporated all of the other German states into a united Germany. Robert Carnero estimated that there were 600,000 political units 100 BC, 100 years before the Common Era, and today there's only 200. In the last 2 centuries, 69 of 210 states, about 30%, have died, and 51 of those 69 died violently. Now, Tilly argues that through a process of natural selection in which weak states were destroyed by the strong in numerous wars, only the strongest states survived. When we look at France or Russia or Greece, we're looking at the survivors of a giant competition. Tilly argues that over the millennium as a whole, war has been the dominant activity of European states. For states to survive, they had to become significantly more efficient. In order for states to survive in war, less energy had to be wasted on internal disputes between lords, and more effort spent on having a state's military forces looking outward. Feudal states were originally mainly decentralized. There was thus considerable effort put into the banning of private domestic armies of the different lords and the destruction of their castles. In their place, the absolute monarchs established centralized militaries under their command for external defense, and police forces for the maintenance of law and order in the interior. Here you can see Frolingham Castle in Suffolk, and you can see Devereux, the Earl of Essex, being executed in 1601 for revolting against Queen Catherine of England. And we can think of the example of Louis XIII, and he did this to France's interior, demolishing more forts during his reign than were actually built. The homicide rate in England fell by 90% compared with today. Urban life in London was dangerous in the 18th century. In fact, even the English king was mugged in his own garden. The civilian populations were thus deprived of their right to bear arms. And although there are exceptions like the US where those types of rights continue to persist. This has also had the effect of disarming bandits on highways and pirates within the countries. And this was followed by most of the states that established domestic order. If you think about it, many of these developments are recent. In the 1970s, the region of Apulia in southern Italy was one of the most dangerous places in Europe for kidnapping. Today, it's an idyllic, peaceful vacation spot. To wage war, it was not enough to have a centralized army, but there was a need for a wide-ranging set of supporting organizations. Treasuries had to be created to fund the militaries and the navies, and to supply services, mechanisms for conscription and the raising of armies, and very importantly, the raising of taxes to pay for all this. Later, to obtain support for war, the states established assemblies and courts to monitor contracts to make states more wealthy and therefore powerful for a subsequent war. You can see here the 15th century court in England and the early 1600s British Parliament under Edward I. For example, Prussia's original tax collection agency was actually part of the General War Commissariat. States evolved increasingly sophisticated systems of finance to fund wars through borrowing. Whereas in the past, states relied on independent banks, by the 17th century, states increasingly relied on national banks and sources of funding. The first major weapons factories were built and owned by the state, particularly in France. For example, in Canada, income tax was introduced as a temporary measure to fund the First World War. But then after the war, it became permanent to fund other programs. The net result of this was that the gradual transformation of European states out of feudalism into an absolutist state system. Supreme sovereignty within the state for the purposes of war making was gradually assumed by the monarch. Louis XIV of France, the absolute monarch, has a famous quote, "L'État c'est moi, and après moi le déluge." For Charles Tilly, war developed the European state, and to a lesser extent all states. Strong states occupied the weaker states, and the weaker states were occupied because of pressures emanating from war. In effect, for Tilly, it's not possible to distinguish between war and development. Since the technological momentum created by the Renaissance, it is frankly hard to distinguish developed and developing states. All states to some extent are developing all the time, just at different rates and with different results. In some sense, the fact that states in Central Africa have been able to wage a war, the war of the Great Lakes, indicates that they're developing an independent bureaucracy, which is a key to developing a powerful state. Capitalist imperialism and war. Many theorists, such as Karl Marx, Johann Galtung, and Noam Chomsky, have identified the link between capitalism and imperialism. They all argue along the lines that because of the diminishing rate of return on capital investment in domestic industries, there is significant pressure to export capital abroad to increase the rate of return. Also, there's a problem of overproduction and the need for new markets. For example, General Motors in Canada, it's an old company, and it has already expanded to its maximum capacity based upon market access in Canada. So if I buy shares in it, I'm going to get a certain dividend annually. If I'm lucky, there's going to be 3 or 4%. Now, the General Motors already sells as many cars as they possibly can to the Canadian population. The market is saturated. So what General Motors wants to do is to sell cars abroad. And if a part of that requirement is set up factories abroad, it'll do that. If we set up a cell phone company in, say, Malaysia, we're going to have a much more rapidly purchasing population for cell phones than if we buy it in a saturated, developed market. So investment capital is therefore always looking for higher rates of return. For theorists like the early John Hobson, he later rejected his own book, and Vladimir Lenin in 1917, building upon Karl Marx's analysis, they linked imperialism to war. The desire to maximize returns on exported investment capital led the European states and Japan to conquer countries in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and China. He therefore tried to explain the rise of European imperialism and hypothesized that the Europeans would cooperate dividing up the world until they ran out of colonies. Since the last major unoccupied territory was China in the world, global war would happen between the world capitalists after they finished occupying China. Now, Latin America was not occupied, but it was heavily indebted to Europe and therefore already integrated and frequently the target of naval diplomacy. Basically, countries that wanted to get their loans repaid would send naval flotillas to threaten these states. The British preserved the Ottoman Empire as a barrier to keep Russia from going into the Mediterranean. And as communications, to protect its communications to India, Iran was divided between Russia and England in terms of spheres of influence, and the US, Japan, and Ethiopia were just too strong to be occupied. However, Lenin's hypothesis is both theoretically and empirically flawed. Number one, theoretically, if capitalism wanted to maximize the return on investment, then they would have gone to war sooner over vital territories, ignoring the poorer areas. The fact was that most capital investment did not go to the equatorial colonies. They did not provide much return on investment, with the exception of the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and the rubber plantations in Indonesia. We've seen this before. You can see that most of the investments went to developed areas, not to conquer colonies. The colonies were not worth fighting over in terms of economic gain, most of them at least. So what do the statistics say? There is evidence that capitalism causes peace, according to Snyder and Gleditsch. Contract-intensive societies are also associated with decreased interstate conflict. Now, most historical evidence shows that trade followed the flag. In other words, countries conquered an area first without a clear idea of what was there to possess, and then the merchants came. So this argument was popularized by the pacifist Bertrand Russell, the idea that trade would occur first and then armies would be sent to protect the merchants. He was a pacifist, but his theory has been called the scandal school theory, and there's very little evidence for it. Jacob Viner, in March of 1929, investigated this conjecture and found very little evidence historically for this relationship. Again, there's a popular historical case I mentioned earlier about the Yalu River dispute, in which the Japanese used a fight over a timber concession as a justification for their conflict. Here you can see the Japanese fighting against the Chinese. Now, ultimately, China was never colonized, and global war occurred sooner before China was colonized, and all the capitalists were mostly allies, not enemies, as Lenin had hypothesized. France, England, and the United States fought together, and the United States actually had very few colonies. They had the Philippines and Cuba. The war occurred not over the colonies, but over the territory of Alsace-Lorraine in Europe, and over allies like Serbia in the heart of Europe. In fact, it has been argued that the colonial period shifted military effort and wars away from Europe to non-Europe. This is termed the safety valve hypothesis, because it was argued that colonial pursuits actually decreased the incidence of major power war. If you think about it, after Napoleon was defeated, quinine and other resources were developed to allow the Europeans to enter Africa without being wiped out by disease, and there was very little great power war except for the Crimean War between England, France, and Russia and the Ottoman Empire until the First World War broke out 99 years after the defeat of Napoleon. Now, the problem with the safety valve hypothesis is that it applies differently across the earlier period of development and the later development of period. If you look at the two periods, 1460 to 1820 versus 1820 to 1960, you'll see a different process. So here you can see the long wave of colonialism, and so you had a fair bit of violence. Countries fought each other for colonies between 1460 and 1820. The Dutch seized the Portuguese colonies in Indonesia. The British took over the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, what became New York City. The English conquered Quebec from the French. After 1820, we have a sort of a different process. Fewer in major power wars. So there's a question as to when the safety valve hypothesis works to create peace and when it doesn't have a presence. Here you can see long waves of major wars overlaid on long waves of colonialism. This is the European colonial conquests of 1810. The British hadn't conquered all of India. You still had the Maratha Empire. South America was mostly occupied, but not southern Argentina. Here's European colonial possessions in 1914. Now, Lenin's most fundamental assumption that the flag follows trade seems to be falsified. That European militaries colonized parts of the world that had potential is wrong. In fact, trade followed the flag more often than not, and conquests were done for strategic reasons, with perhaps the exception being the millennium-old European fascination of trade with China. Now, there's some statistical evidence that control over colonies and multinational corporations are positively linked with the incidence of international conflict, according to Alcock and Young. Now, Leo Blanken, in his book Rational Empires, which is really an excellent showcase for good social scientific methodology, he addresses so many different methodological issues in a compact and efficient fashion. Now, he argues states with non-commercial closed economies, which you'd associate with authoritarian states or states that are not very well developed but have large militaries, and authoritarian economies or centrally driven economies like communist states or military states, these states are rentier states because the political elites sit at the top and they basically get benefits by renting out rights to those individuals that create economic growth within the state. And they have monopolistic economies. They don't want to trade with other people. They're mercantilists. They want to dominate resources for war. These types of states will always invade target states for colonialism. Now, when states with closed economies confront each other over a conquest, they will fight each other. So you have examples of, say, Japan and Russia, which are mercantilist, and they fought over Korea in the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. Now, war is costly. States with open economies and usually political liberal in their governance will seek to trade rather than conquer. When a target state has no capacity for enforcing trade contracts because of institutional weakness, even liberal states will invade them. This explains why Africa was conquered and India was conquered, but China was not. Arrangements could be made with China to protect property rights. Liberal states confront each other over colonialism, but they almost always negotiate rather than fight. The 1884-1885 German conference on how to carve up Africa and to divide it up is an example of how liberal states conjoin in their invasion plans of colonies. Nazli Choucri has a theory called lateral pressure. Nonetheless, there has been some attempt to redefine Hobson and Lenin's hypotheses of capitalist expansion and war by Choucri and North, using sophisticated recursive statistics. This research program is termed lateral pressure theory and argues that as states develop economically and their populations increase, they make demands on international resources, called lateral pressure, and that this increases the use of military force and the likelihood of war. In their case of 6 European powers for the period of 1870 to 1914, they found a weak to moderate evidence that national growth is correlated with external expansion, military spending, alliances, and war. Here you can see the rise of European armies over a 200-year period for the UK, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. Much of this is a function of just increased demographics, and others are the increased power of the state to keep that many soldiers in uniform. Now, the problem with the Choucri and North research is that it can't be contextualized. Capitalist expansion in the 1940s through the 1960s led to decolonization, and some very wealthy economies such as Japan and Germany have expanded without war, although some have argued that they have piggybacked off of U.S. expansion and the U.S. protection of by the Navy. Certainly, the U.S. motive in Kuwait in 1990, 1991, and Panama in 1989 were economic. To stop the concentration of oil wealth in an unfriendly regime, and to keep Panama's canal in friendly hands. Competition for resources can be a cause of war. Here you can see the flow of oil. Certainly, Iraq's union with Kuwait would have created an enormous concentration of oil wealth in a state that had military designs on the region. Gas is important, particularly in the South China Sea, which China is now trying to redefine in contravention of the generally accepted United Nations laws of the sea. Here you can see in the center of the map, on the French-German border, the Saar. This is a coal region, and it was a target of both Germany and France because coal was important for their economies. And so Alsace-Lorraine was not just buffer territory, it was valuable because it contained coal. These are regions of Africa with strategic minerals. And Africa is very wealthy in terms of minerals, particularly South Africa. Here's a map of Sierra Leone in which intrastate rebel activity is associated with diamond regions, which are used to fund those military activities, although this, of course, is not associated with interstate conflict. Now, other statistical studies are more mixed. It's been found that population density and increases in population density are unrelated to war, according to the Correlates of War dataset. Second, underdeveloped states and levels of development in general states are no more likely to go to war. And this comes from a study of 300 deadly quarrels between 1820 and 1945. Number 3, phases of the business cycle in war and peace are also unrelated. However, number 4, war is more likely between underdeveloped or mixed states than between developed states. Bremer found that development reduces the likelihood of conflict only when both states are developed. So what does the evidence tell us? Well, economic growth does lead to war, but this may be because increased power gives increased opportunity to expand, and not because capitalism itself necessarily leads to war. So the United States Navy is colossally influential today. It is more powerful and has more aircraft carriers than the rest of the planet's navies put together. It helps capitalist trade by ensuring that the seaways are not blocked. But it does this through deterrence and not war. Choucri and North did a large end study, but they did no case studies. So we have evidence for a relationship, but we don't have any explanation. For this, we turn to Jack Snyder, who teaches at Columbia University. Jack Snyder and the theory of overexpansion and war. Jack Snyder, using domestic economic development theory, explains why extreme overexpansion has been common among some of the great powers. By overexpansion, Snyder meant expanding in such a way as to provoke an overwhelming counter-coalition. The cases he looks at and tries to explain are Imperial Germany in the First World War and Japan in the Second World War. In both cases, Japan and Germany ended up fighting almost the entire rest of the world. He also looks at England, the Soviet Union, and the United States to explain why they did not overexpand. They expanded in such a way as they did not provoke an overwhelming counter-coalition. So here you can see a map of Germany in the First World War. Well, this is just prior to the First World War when it was still allied to Italy. And after Italy left, Germany and Austria were basically alone, along with the Ottoman Empire. So Jack Snyder provides 3 prerequisites for overexpansion. 1, there must be a belief in the political elite of the domino theory, the belief that gains and losses are cumulative. The domino theory is a belief that argues that expansion adds to the state's strength in terms of the state's ability to defend itself, because it adds resources, and that this permits then further expansion. So expansion builds on expansion. The inverse of the belief is that losses on the periphery lead eventually to the collapse of the center, because the loss of those resources weakens the state, and this then accumulates to further losses. And a state can then not stop the further decline. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, believed, for example, that by occupying Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War, he had added economic strength to the Soviet Union and removed resources away from the Western Alliance. Second, there must be a belief in the offensive advantage. The offensive advantage operates under the principle that the best defense is a good offense. Cumulative gains and the avoidance of cumulative losses in the imperial periphery can be reaped through aggressive action. The best and cheapest way is to avoid cascading dominoes, is to prevent the first domino from falling. This is the dilemma of the US during the Vietnam War. The US was afraid that if they left Vietnam, it would then allow communism to continue to spread to other countries in the region. Ultimately, that's not what happened. It turned out that Thailand was quite strong on its own and able to stop Vietnam. The third belief is the belief in paper tigers and bandwagoning. A belief in paper tigers implies that opponents will back down if faced with threats. In other words, they're tigers, but essentially they're made of paper, so you can stand up to them. States also behave according to bandwagoning logic. They will join the side with the stronger appearance. This is the idea we spoke about earlier about the misperception that bandwagoning is the nature of the system. So Nazi Germany threatened all of its neighbors in the same way that China today typically tries to use threats on its neighbors. These beliefs are dysfunctional because aggressive expansion leads to defeat and is therefore defined as overexpansion. In reality, the international system operates as a balance of power, not a bandwagoning environment. Balance of power logic argues that states will balance against the largest single threat to the system by joining a larger defensive coalition. Therefore, by overexpanding, you're provoking self-encirclement by making unnecessary enemies. So the explanation is as follows. A belief in the domino theory, offensive advantages, and bandwagoning tends to lead to the need for aggressive foreign policies. If you show strength, you will survive, and if you show weakness, other states will take advantage of you. So for example, states that behave aggressively, such as the Soviet Union, they tend to lose and not gain allies. States that are restrained and benign, such as the United States, tend to make allies. So the US has far more allies than the Soviet Union did. By comparison, however, the Soviet Union was restrained. The Soviet political leaders refused to permit an expansion bid until the correlation of forces was in the Soviet favor. Put simply, the Soviet Union would not expand until it had a high probability of victory. In contrast, Germany in the First and the Second World Wars was very risk-prone. In both wars, Germany's strategy was rapid expansion before the balance of power system could operate and counterbalance Hitler. Hitler failed first to invade England and then failed to subdue Russia, and this gave time for the US to enter the war. Overexpansion also exaggerates the belief in the cumulativity of resources. Often, the costs of occupation are underestimated. The costs of occupation during the rise of nationalism after World War II is one of the reasons that European states decolonized. It was simply too expensive to fight counterinsurgencies in all of the colonies. Now, Snyder argues that the reason for overexpansion in states like Japan and Germany, which were totally irrational given the circumstances, can be explained by socio-political coalitions that are the product of the timing of economic development in those countries. So here we're going to explore the link between socioeconomic development and war. So the question becomes, when do political leaders come to believe these myths? For the answer, we look at the industrialization of states. So Alexander Gerschenkron proposed a theory of the timing of industrialization and the type of political structure. In essence, the later the state industrialization, the more centralized is its administration in order to coordinate the development. Thus, the timing of industrialization affects the process of political organization. From 1800 to 1840, you had increases in European manufacturing. You had Great Britain, France, Germany, and Russia. And in part because of population expansion, but also because of industrialization, they were able to develop their economies. The shaded areas on the map are the principal industrial areas that are largely grouped around the availability of coal, which was the principal form of energy. And you can see on the right the rapid increases in production of manufacturing between 1800 and 1840. As you can see here, the focus we have is Great Britain, France, Germany. Russia's not depicted on this map because they develop later. So Great Britain was the first state to industrialize. Actually, as early as the late 1600s. There was almost no central coordination of industrialization. You had individual investors and inventors and capitalists who proceeded through a process of trial and error in creating machine shops, smelting metal, obtaining coal, and building infrastructure, mainly barge canals and later railways. You can see here the economic development of different parts of England, and you can also see Newcomb's steam engine, which was initially used to pump oxygen into mines to facilitate the extraction of coal. You had private inventors like James Hargreaves, who developed the spinning jenny. In recognition of the needs of finance capital, the British Parliament did establish the Bank of England in 1699, the first national bank in Europe. But this was not primarily to support industrial capitalists at the time. On July 27, 1694, William Patterson and Michael Godfrey founded the bank, and they're depicted here in the picture on the bottom left. Charles Montague, in 1694, became the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he is here in the center. The first English banknote was issued on June 18, 1697, and can be seen in the top right. And there you can see the Bank of England, as well as the notched contract sticks. When a contract was signed, a stick was split down the center, one given to the bank and kept in the archives, and the other one given to the contract holder. England's industrialization did not take off until after the defeat of Napoleon in the early 19th century. And by the 1850s, England controlled over 50% of the world's industrial wealth. England's industrialization therefore took place within the context of political decentralization. There was no pressure for an intervention by Parliament in pushing industrialization. But England would not hold on to its gains for long. Here you can see the British Parliament in the 18th century, as well as a British mill in 1820. This is a map of the 1852 British railway system, and you can also see an English pen factory, as well as a Lancashire mill in 1834. The United States followed a similar path of development. Here you can see a Boston sewing machine factory and a mine in Kansas. The US was also very decentralized, and there was no expectation that it was the government's job to arrange for industrialization. Now in France, industrialization followed England quickly, and France could also benefit as a late developer by learning from and avoiding the mistakes made by the English. France instituted a national bank, and the government, through a bureaucracy specifically tasked with encouraging industrialization, took a more direct role than England in directing investment to speed up the process of industrialization. This also permitted France to get to nearly the same level of industrialization with much less time. Though the level of increased centralization was significant, it did not undermine France's democracy, and there was still a significant amount of independent capital. Here you can see Napoleon III, who ruled France from 1852 to 1870. He was largely responsible for the industrialization of France. Now, Wilhelmine Germany was only unified until after the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, and there was a clear strategic imperative to industrialize as quickly as possible in order to provide the manufacturing capability to provide weapons for defense. Germany, having benefited from the lessons of both England and France, could industrialize both in a far more centralized fashion and far more quickly. The government coordinated the investment capital of the traditional landowning class and the merchants, and applied state revenue, and suppressed independent labor unions and free capitalists. This produced a cartelized political system in which there were a number of different stakeholders who had been coordinated by the government. As a late developer, Germany benefited from the mistakes and the success of the French and English experiences. Japan was ultimately to follow a similar pattern. Here you can see Japan in its industrial growth between 1880 and 1922. One of the reasons Japan was so successful was, like Germany, it had a very efficient bureaucracy that had been developed in the previous 2 centuries. The French bureaucracy, the Japanese bureaucracy was remarkably uncorrupt. Here you can see a Japanese silk mill in 1905, and you can see in the bar chart the growth of Japanese trade on the right, and it was incredibly rapid, just a magnitude increase in about 30 years. Later developers, termed the late developers, are typified by the Soviet Union. Building upon the infrastructure established by the Russian industrial spurt prior to the First World War, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, was able to industrialize the Soviet Union in only 15 years. Despite the tremendous suffering this entailed, including the starvation of millions of Ukrainian farmers, the Soviet Union benefited from a hyper-centralized political system to coordinate industrialization. All capital was monopolized by the state, and private ownership of capital was illegal. In the place of banks and the market, there was a central plan and a command economy that directed the allocation of resources. The Soviet Union very efficiently could borrow successful ideas from both early and late industrializers, and it permitted them to catch up even more quickly. Here you can see the Soviet push from European Russia and pushing industrialization into Central Asia and into the East along railroad lines that connected up resources, primarily coal. So the later a state industrialized, the more centralized was its government as a consequence of the attempt to industrialize. In the early industrializers, such as England, France, and the United States, democracy prevailed because of the absence of an intense pressure to force industrialization for security reasons. In democracy, pressure from the population against state control and against having to bear the costs of imperial expansion generally acted against tendencies to overexpand. For example, Prime Ministers Gladstone and Prime Ministers Disraeli of England perpetually disagreed over whether England should increase or decrease its empire in the mid-19th century. Although Disraeli wanted expansion, Gladstone argued that the population would never bear it and that therefore expansion had to occur gradually. Ultimately, Disraeli prevailed. But Gladstone, who actually called for the English abandonment of India as a colony because it only benefited the English, ultimately did succeed some decades later. The exception is that if anti-imperial groups are affected by short-term gains from expansion, they might pursue the politics of overexpansion. If expansion is inexpensive, then domestic groups might come to believe that myths that lead to overexpansion. Israel during and after the June 1967 Six-Day War is a good example of this. The late developers, there emerged a unitary political system ruled by a dictator, such as the Communist Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin or Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, which had to rebuild following reparations and the Great Depression. With centralized states, the extent of overexpansion is far more the result of the individual leader's schematic understanding of the link between expansion and security. The complete centralization of the state and the lack of political cartelization means that there are no powerful domestic groups to challenge the dictator, either for or against expansion. In the case of Joseph Stalin, the goal was the consolidation of Soviet communism, and therefore avoiding overexpansion so as not to provoke attacks from more powerful Western states. In contrast, Adolf Hitler adopted the foreign policy that Germany had unsuccessfully attempted during the First World War, which was a broad domination of Europe. So countries where the timing of industrialization started only moderately late, as in Germany, Japan, and Italy, had sought a political system that was more centralized than democracy to facilitate industrialization, but the state could not overcome powerful domestic groups such as the military, urban industrialists, the state bureaucracy, the traditional landowners, and finance capitalists that were focused abroad, in order to centralize the state. This cartelized political structure makes the state vulnerable to being captured by narrow imperialist groups that can form log-rolled coalitions between these different domestic groups and stakeholders. So the link between log rolling in cartelized states and overexpansion is as follows. 1. These narrow stakeholder groups create log-rolled coalitions between diverse interests of different domestic groups, in which each member derives a different benefit from the promotion of the shared goal. The analogy is having many different groups push a log together. Now, while this solves the collective action problem, because it coordinates everyone's action, it makes learning difficult because once the log-rolled coalition is formed, no one group is actually in charge. Without learning, it's impossible to evaluate whether a given policy is overexpansion or not. Number 2, this log-rolled coalition pays for overexpansion by capturing the state and using the tax revenues from the state. It also uses the state's control over information to obtain a monopoly of information, and through propaganda to popularize the 3 aforementioned myths of imperialism, which then permit the expansion of the state. Number 3, the log-rolled coalition falls victim to its own propaganda, and it comes to believe that expansion is necessary. And this is reinforced by pressure from the masses that have either come to accept the imperial myths, or segments of which have joined the log-rolled coalition. So this elite self-delusion is termed blowback, and it describes propaganda that has taken on a life of its own. Number 4, the log-rolled coalition has diverse interests that are combined into imperialism, and taken individually are low risk and moderate, but taken together create overexpansion. The desire of the industrial capitalists is for external markets. For the military, it's for defensible frontiers and possibly colonies. For finance capitalists, it's for external investment targets. And of popular demands, it overreaches the state's capacity and its ability to coordinate all of these interests. Now, some of the members of the log-rolled coalitions inevitably will fall into relative decline, such as the traditional landowners in Germany relative to the rise of the urban capitalists. This leads them to shorten their time horizon and increase their risk acceptance, and to advocate aggressive foreign policies to regain their original power position. So if we apply this, both Wilhelmine Germany in the First World War and Japan in the Second World War were cartelized states. I would even go so far as to disagree with Jack Snyder and argue that post-Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union was a cartelized state also, as it came to be based on domestic political, military, industrial, and intelligence factions that sought Soviet supremacy, despite the amount of self-encirclement it produced. The effects of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was to mobilize traditional Western and non-Western states in a military buildup against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So here, if we look at this chart, you can see the different states represented by how late they industrialized. And we could look at the impact it had on elite interests, the type of politics, myth-making, the learning, and ultimately whether or not it produced overexpansion. So the results in the case are, as you had read in the case study of Japan and its cartelization, the ultimate result was an attack on the US by Japan at Pearl Harbor. And this attack had almost no chance of producing victory in war. So here's Japan's initial position. It wanted to create a sphere of control over China. It wanted to create a region of supplies that in Southeast Asia where it could get oil and rubber and other resources. And it wanted a region of defense which included the islands in the Pacific from which it could launch aircraft and coordinate a naval defense against the US. But ultimately, Japan encircled itself. It basically went to war against every single country in Asia and was ultimately defeated. Now, there's a criticism of Jack Snyder's theory, and it comes mostly from Fareed Zakaria. Realist critics argue that overexpansion cannot be derived from domestic level variables, because overexpansion is a systemic level outcome occurring between states. The same cartelized behavior in one geopolitical setting may not produce the same amount of self-encirclement in another geopolitical setting. We take, for example, the British Empire. It expanded very rapidly in the 1750s, capturing North America, India, and securing control of the high seas. Now, at the time, it didn't produce a counterbalancing coalition to stop it. But when the American Revolution occurred, there was a revenge war in which France and Spain coordinated an attack on England sufficient to give the US its independence. In 1909, here, the English controlled 23% of the world's population. Now, critics also point out that the benefits of late development do not apply to late developers because of the theory of dependency. The argument that the entry costs of capitalism are too high and therefore states are actually structurally inhibited from developing by the most advanced capitalist states. Now, this criticism is weakened by the fact that development in states such as South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore was very rapid from the 1980s on. The current relevance of Snyder's theory is to wonder about the political structural effects of industrialization in states like China, India, and Iran, and to see whether these political structures will produce the cartelization that is likely to produce overexpansion.